A day like any other. The sun cast a warm, amber glow over the city skyline as Marcia Wilson adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the fading daylight. It was the end of a long, demanding day, and she was ready to go home, unwind, and let the tensions of the day melt away. But as she drove through the familiar streets, her thoughts weren't on dinner or relaxation. They were on the work that lay ahead, work that was more challenging and important than anything she'd ever faced. It had been a month since Marcia was appointed as the new chief of police in a city fraught with tension, a city where race and authority often collided. Marcia, a black woman, had broken countless barriers on her way to this position, but she was acutely aware that her journey was far from over. Her promotion had made headlines, celebrated by some and resented by others. She wasn't naive. She knew there were officers in her precinct who didn't believe she deserved her position, who thought her appointment was merely a political statement. But Marcia had never been one to back down. She climbed the ranks from beat cop to detective, then captain, and now chief, all through sheer grit and an unshakable commitment to justice. She wanted to change things from the inside, especially in a precinct that had a reputation for strained relations with minority communities. She wanted to bridge the divide, build trust, and ensure that the officers under her command treated everyone with respect, regardless of their background. Her thoughts drifted to her father, a civil rights activist who had spent his life fighting for equality and justice. Growing up, Marcia had watched him organize protests, give speeches, and stand up for those who had no voice. His work had inspired her to join law enforcement, not to uphold the status quo, but to reform it from within. As she drove through her childhood neighborhood, memories flooded her mind. She remembered walking these streets as a teenager, acutely aware of the police presence, the way officers would watch her and her friends with suspicion. She remembered her father's words, "Justice isn't about power, it's about respect. And respect has to go both ways." Those words had guided her through her career, and now, as chief of police, they felt more relevant than ever. Lost in her thoughts, Marcia barely noticed the police cruisers speeding up behind her until the flash of blue and red lights illuminated her rearview mirror. Startled, she glanced down at her speedometer. She was well within the limit. Confused, she signaled and pulled over, wondering why she was being stopped. As the cruiser came to a halt behind her, two officers stepped out. Both were white, both male, and both exuded an air of authority. They approached her car slowly, deliberately, as if preparing for something far more serious than a routine traffic stop. Marcia's heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She recognized the situation for what it was. These officers were making assumptions based on her appearance, her car, her presence in this part of town. She knew the signs all too well, having witnessed them throughout her career. But this time, the irony was undeniable. They had no idea they were pulling over their own boss. The taller officer, whose badge read Stevens, knocked on her window with an almost dismissive firmness. His partner, Officer Harris, stood slightly behind, arms crossed, his gaze scanning the surroundings as though anticipating trouble. Marcia rolled down her window, meeting their gaze with a calm but unyielding stare. She noticed the way Officer Stevens's eyes flickered with a hint of surprise, as if her confidence caught him off guard. "License and registration, ma'am," he said, his tone cold and authoritative. Without a word, Marcia handed over her documents, letting her silence speak volumes. She could see Stevens's surprise as he glanced at her license, recognizing the name but not quite placing it. He quickly regained his composure, though, adopting a dismissive tone that grated on her nerves. "What are you doing in this part of town?" Stevens asked, holding her license, as if it were something suspicious. Marcia kept her voice even. "I live nearby," she replied, refusing to give him any more information than necessary. She could sense the thinly veiled prejudice in his question, the unspoken implication that she didn't belong here. It was an old tactic, one she knew well, a way to establish control, to assert that she was being watched, evaluated, questioned. Officer Harris, who had been silent up to this point, now spoke up. "Ma'am, we've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. We need to know what you're doing here at this time." Marcia suppressed a sigh. She'd heard these lines before, countless times, directed at people who looked like her. The words were laced with unspoken assumptions, a convenient excuse to mask prejudice as routine procedure. But she knew this was more than just a traffic stop. This was a test of her resolve, her composure, her principles. She had a choice. She could end this entire exchange with a few words, revealing her identity as their new chief of police. But Marcia decided to wait. She wanted to see how far these officers would take this charade, how deeply their prejudices ran. After all, as a leader, she needed to understand the mindset of those under her command. "I was just driving home," Marcia said, keeping her tone neutral. She watched as Stevens's expression hardened, his frustration growing with her lack of compliance to his unspoken demands for deference. Stevens leaned in closer, his face mere inches from hers, his voice laced with thinly veiled contempt. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, Mom." For a moment, Marcia considered her options. She could comply, let them continue this power play a little longer, or she could put an end to it right now. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. These two officers, so confident in their authority, had no idea they were talking to their new superior. Instead of stepping out, Marcia looked directly at Officer Stevens, holding his gaze with a calm intensity. "Officer," she began, her voice steady, carrying an unmistakable edge, "do you know who I am?" The question hung in the air, a quiet challenge that shattered the confident expressions on both officers' faces. They exchanged a quick, uncertain glance, clearly thrown off by her question. Stevens's confident demeanor faltered, a flash of doubt flickering in his eyes. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Should I know?" Marcia allowed herself a slight, enigmatic smile, a smile that held both strength and warning. "Let's just say you're going to want to reconsider how you proceed from here." Officer Harris, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, took a step forward, his tone now edged with a hint of apprehension. "Ma'am, we're just following procedure here." Marcia's smile faded, her expression hardening as she sat up straighter. "Is that so?" she said, her voice dropping to a cold, authoritative tone. "Because last I checked, the new chief of police is supposed to be briefed on any incidents like this, and I don't recall giving permission for this stop." The silence that followed was almost deafening, an unspoken tension filling the space between them. Both officers stood frozen, processing her words, the reality of the situation sinking in. Marcia watched their faces, noting the mix of disbelief, confusion, and growing fear as they began to grasp the gravity of their mistake. Officer Stevens's face paled, his confidence evaporating as he struggled to find his footing. Chief Wilson," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "That's correct," Marcia replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next." The two officers looked at each other, their initial arrogance replaced with a dawning realization that their assumptions had led them straight into a dangerous miscalculation. The balance of power had shifted, and Marcia could see the fear in their eyes, the shame as they recognized their own biases laid bare. Officer Harris, the quieter of the two, took a tentative step forward, his voice subdued. "Chief Wilson, we didn't know. We had no idea it was you." Marcia's gaze turned steely. "That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't know it was me. You had no issue pulling over a black woman driving through this neighborhood. But now that you realize I'm the chief, suddenly everything's different." Harris looked down, his face a mask of shame, while Stevens struggled to maintain some semblance of dignity, though his defiance had all but crumbled. "We were just doing our job, Chief," Stevens mumbled, his voice unsteady. "Your job." Marcia's voice was sharp, cutting through his weak excuse. "Is that what you call this? Harassing citizens, intimidating them because of the color of their skin or the way they look? Let me make one thing very clear. This is not how we do things in my precinct." Both officers looked as though the ground had dropped out from under them. Their earlier bravado had dissolved, leaving only two men who had misused their power and been caught in the act. "This isn't just about me," Marcia continued, her voice low but filled with unshakable resolve. "It's about every person who has ever been stopped, harassed, or mistreated by this department because of the color of their skin. And as long as I'm chief, this behavior ends here." Power and prejudice unmasked. Marcia Wilson watched Officer Stevens and Officer Harris as her words settled over them like an avalanche, breaking down the walls of arrogance and entitlement they had built around themselves. In their eyes, she could see the stark realization of what they'd done, the dawning awareness that their biases had led them straight into this confrontation with someone who now held the reins to their careers. For a moment, no one moved. Marcia could feel the tension in the air, thick with the gravity of the unspoken truths hanging between them. She let the silence stretch, watching as the confidence in their eyes flickered and faltered, leaving only discomfort and perhaps a hint of regret. "Chief Wilson, Officer Harris started, his voice barely more than a whisper. He seemed to be grasping for words, searching for something to explain away their actions, to mitigate the damage they'd inflicted upon themselves. But the usual rehearsed lines and excuses wouldn't save them this time. Marcia held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I don't need explanations. I've been in this city long enough to know exactly how things work here, Officer Harris. I've seen firsthand the biases, the assumptions, and the abuse of authority that some officers exercise, especially against people who look like me." She spoke calmly, each word measured and deliberate, the authority in her tone unmistakable. Officer Stevens, struggling to regain some semblance of composure, finally managed to speak. "Chief, we didn't mean any disrespect. We were just following up on a report of suspicious activity in the area." His voice was a poor imitation of the commanding tone he'd used earlier, now wavering, uncertain. Marcia's eyes narrowed, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Suspicious activity. Let me ask you something, Officer Stevens. If I hadn't revealed who I was, what would have happened next? Would you have demanded I step out of the car, searched my vehicle without cause, escalated this stop just to prove a point?" She could see the shame flicker across his face, the way he shifted uncomfortably as her questions cut through his thin excuses. I don't know, Chief," Stevens mumbled, looking down at the ground. "That's exactly the problem," Marcia replied, her voice laced with disappointment. "You didn't know. And because you didn't know, you chose to assume the worst about me simply because I was driving through this neighborhood. You looked at me and decided I was out of place, that I needed to be questioned, that I didn't belong." The silence that followed was thick with tension and discomfort. Officer Harris, clearly less hardened than Stevens, seemed to shrink under Marcia's gaze, his expression filled with a mixture of embarrassment and shame. Marcia could tell he was struggling with the implications of her words, recognizing that this moment was about far more than a simple traffic stop. But Stevens, though visibly shaken, still clung to a shred of defiance. He straightened his back, attempting to salvage some control over the situation. "Chief, we didn't know it was you. If we had, things would have been different." Marcia's gaze turned icy, her voice sharper than ever. "And that's precisely the issue, Officer Stevens. It shouldn't matter who I am. Whether I'm your chief or a woman driving home from work, I deserve the same respect and fairness as anyone else. Your job is to serve and protect, not to judge and harass based on appearances." Stevens's face hardened slightly, his pride stung by her reprimand. He looked as though he wanted to argue, to defend himself, but Marcia's unyielding stare stopped him. She could see the battle raging within him, the struggle between his ingrained biases and the reality of his mistake. And for once, it seemed he was losing that internal fight. After a long pause, Stevens finally nodded, though his face was still set in a tense, stubborn expression. "Understood, Chief," he said, his tone subdued, though Marcia could hear the reluctance in his voice. Marcia took a deep breath, choosing her next words carefully. She wasn't here just to reprimand them. She wanted them to understand, to truly grasp the weight of their actions and what they represented. "Let me tell you a story," she began, her voice softening slightly, though it still carried a powerful undercurrent. "I grew up in this city, in a neighborhood not too far from here. I remember walking these streets as a teenager, and I remember the way officers used to look at me and my friends, the way they'd pull us over, question us, make us feel like we didn't belong. I know what it feels like to be seen as a threat in your own community, simply because of the color of your skin." She saw a flicker of something in Officer Harris's eyes, perhaps empathy, perhaps regret. She continued, "My father was a civil rights activist, a man who spent his life fighting for equality and justice. He taught me that justice is more than just enforcing the law. It's about treating people with dignity and respect. That's why I joined the force, why I worked so hard to reach this position. I wanted to make a difference, to change the way things are done." Marcia paused, allowing her words to sink in. She could see that she had struck a chord with Harris, who now looked genuinely remorseful. Stevens, on the other hand, still wore an expression of conflicted pride, as though he were wrestling with the weight of his own assumptions. "But here's the thing," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Change doesn't happen just because I became chief. Change happens when each of us chooses to see beyond our biases, to question our assumptions, to treat every person we encounter with respect. And that includes you." Both officers remained silent, absorbing the gravity of her words. Marcia took a step back, crossing her arms as she looked at them, her gaze unwavering. "This incident will not be swept under the rug," she said firmly. "When I took this position, I promised to hold everyone in this department accountable, including myself. And that means I expect every officer under my command to live up to the highest standards of integrity and respect." Officer Harris finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "We're sorry, Chief. We didn't mean to treat you that way." Marcia nodded, acknowledging his apology. "I appreciate that, Officer Harris. But apologies are just words. What I need from you, and from every officer in this department, is action. A commitment to doing better, to recognizing and confronting your biases. Because if we don't, then we're no better than the injustices we claim to fight against." Harris nodded, his face filled with genuine remorse. Stevens, though still somewhat guarded, seemed to be softening as well, his earlier defiance giving way to a grudging acceptance of his error. Marcia looked at them both, feeling a sense of tired satisfaction. This was just one confrontation, one small victory in a much larger battle. But it was a start, a step toward building the culture of respect and accountability she envisioned for her precinct. "Now," she said, her tone shifting back to that of a commanding officer, "you're both dismissed. I expect you to reflect on this incident, and I'll be following up to ensure that you're committed to making changes." "Understood." "Yes, Chief," they replied in unison, their voices subdued, their heads bowed slightly. With that, they turned and walked back to their cruiser, their steps less assured than when they'd first approached her car. Marcia watched them go, a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion settling over her. She knew this moment was a small victory, but she also knew it was symbolic of the deeper, systemic change that she was fighting to bring about. As she climbed back into her car and continued her drive home, Marcia felt a surge of determination. This was the first of many battles she would face as chief, and it wouldn't be the last time she would have to confront the ingrained biases of her officers. But she was ready. She was prepared to fight, to push, to demand the respect and justice that her community deserved. When she finally arrived home, Marcia found herself greeted by the warmth and familiarity of her living room. She sank into the couch, letting out a deep breath as the day's tension finally began to ease. She looked around at the framed photographs on the wall, reminders of her journey, of the people who had shaped her, of the legacy she hoped to leave behind. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her father, simply reading, "Proud of you, Always. A small smile tugged at her lips as she read the words, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Her father had taught her to stand firm, to fight for what was right, even when the odds were against her. And now, as chief of police, she was finally in a position to make a difference, to challenge the system from within. Marcia knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that she would face resistance, pushback, and perhaps even hostility from those who clung to the old ways. But she was ready for it. She was ready to face every challenge, every confrontation, with the same unyielding resolve she had shown today. This was only the beginning. Lines drawn in the sand. The following morning, Marcia Wilson strode confidently into the precinct, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she made her way to her office. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, officers and staff alike, glancing her way with expressions that ranged from curiosity to trepidation. It was clear that word of her encounter with Officers Stevens and Harris had spread through the ranks. In less than 24 hours, her confrontation had become the topic of whispers and hushed conversations throughout the precinct. Marcia was not surprised. In a precinct like hers, the news of a black female chief calling out two of her own officers on their prejudiced behavior was bound to ripple through the department. She welcomed the attention, though. If her officers thought she would tolerate misconduct and biases, it was time they understood who they were dealing with. As she entered her office, Marcia found herself greeted by her assistant, Liz, who had been with the department for nearly 2 decades. Liz was a seasoned professional, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp eye for detail and a quiet authority that Marcia had come to respect. "Chief," Liz began, her voice low, "I got something for you." She handed Marcia a slim file, her expression unreadable. Marcia took the file and flipped it open. Inside was a formal complaint, signed by Officer Stevens. The complaint, though professionally worded, accused her of abusing her authority and publicly humiliating him and his partner. Marcia's jaw tightened as she scanned the document, her mind processing each line. She looked up at Liz, who was watching her carefully. "They filed a complaint against me?" she asked, incredulous but not entirely surprised. Liz nodded, a hint of irritation flashing across her face. "Yes, Chief. They submitted it first thing this morning. Stevens is claiming that you singled him out, that you misunderstood his intentions and acted unprofessionally." Marcia let out a slow breath, closing the file. She knew this tactic well. It was a classic move. Turn the tables, make the accuser look unreasonable, and try to shield oneself under claims of victimhood. It was a ploy to paint her as the aggressor, to undermine her authority, and to discredit her stance on fairness and accountability. "Not unexpected," she murmured, placing the file on her desk. "He's trying to protect himself, to deflect from his own behavior." Liz nodded. "Yes, but it's a dangerous move, Chief. Filing a formal complaint against the new chief of police, especially one who's trying to reform the precinct. That's bold." Marcia's eyes narrowed as she considered her options. She knew she couldn't ignore the complaint, but neither could she allow it to derail her mission. "Liz, let's set up a meeting with Stevens and Harris. I want to address this face to face." Liz nodded, her expression one of quiet approval. "I'll make the arrangements. Do you want anyone else there?" "Yes," Marcia replied after a moment's thought. "Bring Captain Reed in as well. He needs to witness this conversation. If Stevens wants to make this formal, then we'll handle it professionally. But I want him to understand that filing a complaint won't shield him from accountability." Liz gave her a curt nod, then disappeared down the hallway, her heels clicking with purpose. By noon, the meeting was arranged. Marcia sat at the head of the long conference table, with Captain Reed on her left. Reed, a seasoned officer nearing retirement, had been a fixture in the department for decades. He was known for his fairness and professionalism, but also for his adherence to tradition. Marcia knew that Reed would offer a steadying presence in the room, a reminder to Stevens and Harris that this was no ordinary meeting. Stevens and Harris entered, their postures stiff and formal, though Marcia could see the flicker of unease in their eyes. They took their seats opposite her, each of them glancing at Captain Reed as if seeking his silent approval. Marcia observed them for a moment, letting the silence settle before she spoke. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I've reviewed your complaint. I wanted to meet with you to discuss it directly, as I believe transparency and open communication are essential in this department." Stevens cleared his throat, his gaze meeting hers with a touch of defiance. "Chief, with all due respect, we feel that we were treated unfairly. We were simply doing our jobs, following up on a report. The interaction could have been handled differently." Marcia's eyes held his, her expression unyielding. "And how do you believe it should have been handled, Officer Stevens? Do you feel that stopping a citizen without cause, questioning them based on appearance alone, is within the bounds of your duty?" Stevens shifted in his seat, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "Chief, we had a report of suspicious activity in the area. We acted on the information we had." Marcia leaned forward, her gaze penetrating. "And what exactly was suspicious about me, Stevens? Was it my car? My presence in the neighborhood? Or perhaps it was something else?" A brief, uncomfortable silence followed. Harris looked down, avoiding her gaze, but Stevens held firm, though his bravado had noticeably softened. "We had no way of knowing it was you, Chief," he replied, his tone defensive. "If we'd known, we would have handled it differently." "That's the issue, Officer Stevens," Marcia said sharply. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Whether I'm the chief of police or an ordinary citizen, I should be treated with respect and fairness. Your actions weren't based on any real evidence. They were based on assumptions. Assumptions that have no place in law enforcement." Captain Reed, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up, his voice a calm but authoritative presence. "Officer Stevens, Officer Harris, the chief has made a valid point. The core of our work is to serve and protect, without bias or prejudice. You need to understand that this isn't just about one interaction. It's about upholding the integrity of this department." Stevens looked momentarily deflated, but then he straightened, his expression hardening. "With all due respect, sir, we can't ignore patterns of behavior. Certain areas of the city have higher crime rates, and we're trained to look for potential threats. Sometimes that means making judgment calls." Marcia's patience thinned, but she kept her voice steady. "And what judgment call did you make about me, Officer Stevens? That I was a threat because of the color of my skin? Because I was driving in a certain neighborhood? If that's how you view your job, then we have a much larger problem on our hands." Stevens glanced at Captain Reed, his jaw clenched. "Chief, with respect, you're making this about race." Marcia didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her expression unwavering. "I'm not making this about race, Officer Stevens. You did, when you decided that I was suspicious based on nothing more than my presence in the area. You made it about race." The silence in the room was tense, thick with unspoken words. Marcia could feel Captain Reed's support beside her, a silent affirmation that she wasn't alone in this. Harris finally looked up, his face a mask of genuine regret. "Chief, I realize now that we may have acted on assumptions. I didn't think of it that way at the time, but I see where you're coming from, and I'm sorry." Marcia nodded, acknowledging his apology. "Thank you, Officer Harris. Recognizing our biases is the first step toward change. None of us are perfect, but we are all accountable for our actions." She turned her gaze back to Stevens, who looked less certain now, his previous defiance eroding under her scrutiny. "Officer Stevens," Marcia said, her tone softening but still firm, "I understand that this is difficult. No one likes to admit when they've made a mistake, especially in a position of authority. But if we're going to create a culture of respect in this department, it starts here. It starts with owning up to our actions and understanding their impact." Stevens shifted, his gaze dropping to the table. Marcia could see the internal struggle playing out on his face, the reluctance to admit fault, the discomfort with being challenged on his biases. But after a long, tense pause, he finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Chief, I'm sorry. I didn't see it that way. I let my assumptions guide my actions, and that wasn't right." Marcia nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Officer Stevens. I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge this. Moving forward, I expect both of you to think more critically about the assumptions you make, especially when interacting with members of the community." Captain Reed nodded in agreement, his voice calm but firm. "This is about building trust, gentlemen. Trust with the community and trust within this department. If we're going to do our jobs effectively, we need that trust." Marcia leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of resolution. The meeting had been difficult, but it was a necessary step in the right direction. She knew that changing a culture didn't happen overnight, but conversations like these were the foundation of the progress she wanted to build. "Thank you, both of you," she said, her tone signaling the end of the meeting. "I'm counting on you to set an example, to show the community that we can do better." This, challenging the system. The meeting with Officers Stevens and Harris had gone as well as Marcia could have hoped, but she knew that a few apologies and some uncomfortable admissions were just the beginning. Changing the culture of a police department was like trying to turn a massive ship. It required patience, persistence, and a willingness to steer through rough waters. As the week progressed, Marcia's stance and the encounter with the officers continued to ripple through the precinct. Some of her officers reacted with quiet respect, admiring her firmness and clarity, while others whispered among themselves, questioning her methods and her motivations. The precinct was divided, and Marcia could feel the tension whenever she walked through the hallways. One afternoon, Captain Reed stopped by her office with an expression that was more serious than usual. He took a seat across from her, folding his hands on the desk. "Chief Wilson," he began, "I thought you should know that there's been some pushback from a few of the senior officers." Marcia raised an eyebrow. "Pushback? In what form?" Reed hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Some of them feel that you're focusing too much on internal issues, discipline, accountability, and, let's say, cultural change. They're worried it's affecting morale, especially among those who feel they're being unfairly scrutinized." Marcia gave a slight nod, unsurprised but disappointed. She had expected some resistance, but hearing it directly from her second-in-command underscored the depth of the challenge she faced. "And what do you think, Captain?" Reed's face softened, a hint of concern in his eyes. "I think you're doing what's necessary. But I also think that you need allies in this department, Chief. There are officers who respect you, and there are those who feel threatened by the changes you're trying to bring. If you push too hard without support, you might find yourself isolated." Marcia let out a slow breath, taking in Reed's advice. She had always respected him for his wisdom and his steady, even-handed approach to leadership. He had seen countless chiefs come and go, and his loyalty to the department was evident in everything he did. If he was advising caution, it was because he genuinely wanted her to succeed. "I hear you, Reed," she said after a moment. "But I can't ignore the issues that are right in front of us. This precinct has a reputation that we both know isn't undeserved. If I don't hold people accountable, we'll continue to lose trust with the community. And without that trust, our work means nothing." Reed nodded thoughtfully. "I don't disagree, Chief. But maybe there's a way to bring people on board, to help them see the benefits of these changes rather than viewing them as a threat." Marcia leaned back in her chair, considering his words. Building trust within the department would be just as critical as building trust with the community. Without internal support, she risked creating a backlash that could undermine her efforts or, worse, lead to active resistance from within. "I appreciate your advice, Captain," she said finally. "Let's set up a meeting with some of the senior officers. I want to hear their concerns directly, and I want them to understand why I'm taking this approach. If they feel alienated, it's my job to address it." Reed smiled, a glint of approval in his eyes. "I'll arrange it, Chief. And for what it's worth, I think you're handling this well. Change is never easy, but it's clear to me that you're committed to doing what's right. The following week, Marcia held a meeting with a group of senior officers. They gathered in the conference room, a mix of seasoned veterans and newer surgeons, all of whom had been in the department long enough to remember previous leadership changes. The mood was tense, the air filled with a quiet anticipation as they settled into their seats, exchanging glances with one another. Marcia took a moment to survey the room, noting the variety of expressions, some guarded, some curious, a few openly skeptical. She felt the weight of their expectations, the collective resistance to change that lay beneath the surface. But she also felt a quiet determination, a reminder of why she had taken this job in the first place. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I wanted to meet with you today to discuss the changes I'm implementing and to hear any concerns you might have. I know there's been some tension, and I think it's important that we address it directly." A few officers shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the openness of her approach. One of them, Lieutenant Grayson, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gruff demeanor, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Chief, I think some of us are concerned that the focus on internal accountability is, well, it's creating an atmosphere of mistrust," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We're here to protect the public, to keep the city safe. But lately, it feels like we're being put under a microscope, and it's affecting morale." Marcia met his gaze evenly. "I understand your concern, Lieutenant, but let me ask you something. How do you think the community feels when they see officers treating them with suspicion, making assumptions based on appearance rather than behavior?" Grayson hesitated, his expression faltering slightly. I see your point, Chief, but it's different. We're trained to recognize patterns, to spot potential threats. Sometimes that means making tough calls, and yes, sometimes we rely on instinct." Marcia nodded. "I'm not here to take away your instincts, Lieutenant. I know that policing isn't black and white. But what I am asking is that we take a closer look at those instincts, to question whether they're based on experience or on biases that we may not even be aware of." A younger sergeant, Officer Alvarez, leaned forward, her face thoughtful. "Chief, I think what you're saying makes sense, but I also think some of the officers feel attacked, like they're being accused of something before they've even done anything wrong." Marcia softened her tone, understanding the frustration. "I'm not here to attack anyone. I'm here to help us do better. Every single person in this room has a responsibility to the public, to uphold the values of respect and fairness. And yes, that includes examining our own actions and biases." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "We're not just enforcers of the law. We're representatives of this community. When we pull someone over, question them, or make an arrest, we're making an impact on their lives. That impact should be positive, not one that leaves people feeling humiliated or afraid." Captain Reed, seated beside her, nodded in agreement, adding, "The Chief is right. This isn't about tearing anyone down. It's about building something better. We're here to serve the community, and part of that is ensuring that our actions reflect the values we stand for." Another officer, Sergeant Blake, an older man who had been with the department for over 20 years, spoke up, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Chief, with all due respect, we've had other leaders come in here with big ideas about change and reform. They talk a big game, but nothing ever really changes. Why should we believe this time is different?" Marcia looked at him, her expression unwavering. "Because I'm not just here to talk. I'm here to lead by example. And that means holding myself and each of you to the same standards. I understand that change is difficult, and I know that some of you are wary. But I promise you, if we work together, if we're willing to look honestly at our actions, we can create a department that serves every member of this community with dignity and respect." Blake nodded slowly, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Marcia could see that years of seeing promises broken had left him jaded, reluctant to trust any leader. But she was determined to show him, and everyone in the room, that she was committed to this mission. "Look," Marcia continued, her tone softening. I know there are concerns, and I'm not saying that the changes I'm implementing will be easy or quick, but I'm here for the long haul. I didn't take this position to maintain the status quo. I took it to make a difference, to leave this department better than I found it. There was a moment of silence as her words sank in. She could see the flicker of understanding in some of their eyes, the beginning of a shift, however small. But she knew this was only the first step. Earning their trust would take time, and proving herself would require more than words. I'm not asking for blind faith, she said finally. I'm asking for a chance to prove that this can work. I'll work with you, listen to you, and make sure that any changes are fair and reasonable. But I need your support. I need each of you to stand with me, to be part of this effort, because we can't do this alone. One by one, the officers nodded, some with more enthusiasm than others. Lieutenant Grayson looked thoughtful, his previous defensiveness softened. Sergeant Alvarez smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Even Sergeant Blake, though clearly still skeptical, gave her a respectful nod, as if acknowledging her sincerity. As the meeting concluded, Marcia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew there would still be challenges, resistance, and possibly even backlash. But for the first time since taking on this role, she felt a glimmer of unity. You said, start with part 5 more unique and lengthy. ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Part 5. A new dawn, a new challenge. The meeting with the senior officers had been a step forward, but Marcia knew it was only the beginning of the battle. As chief, she was starting to see the larger picture of what she was up against. The issue wasn't just about a few bad interactions or individual biases. It was about the entire structure of the department, a system with deep-seated issues that resisted change at every turn. In the days following the meeting, Marcia noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere at the precinct. Some officers were more respectful, greeting her with nods that carried a new weight, as if they were finally starting to recognize her authority. Others, however, became even more aloof, their cold stares and whispered conversations a reminder that her mission was far from accepted by everyone. The walls of the precinct felt both familiar and foreign, and she knew she was walking a narrow line. The resistance was most palpable when she introduced new training programs. These weren't typical procedural trainings. They focused on cultural competency, implicit bias, and community relations, topics that many of her officers had never been required to confront. Marcia knew these trainings were essential if they were to repair the fractured relationship between the police and the community, but the response was mixed at best. One afternoon, Marcia received an email from Officer Stevens, the same officer she had confronted during that infamous traffic stop. He requested a private meeting, citing concerns about departmental morale and recent changes. Marcia felt a pang of frustration, but she reminded herself that this was precisely the kind of engagement she wanted. If Stevens had concerns, he needed to voice them directly to her. When Stevens entered her office, he was tense, his face etched with a mixture of frustration and determination. He took a seat across from her, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on hers. Marcia sat back, keeping her expression neutral, waiting for him to begin. Chief Wilson, he started, his tone clipped. I wanted to talk to you about these new training programs. A lot of us, we're struggling to understand the purpose behind them. Marcia raised an eyebrow. The purpose is to improve our relationships with the community, Officer Stevens. It's about understanding the people we serve, seeing them as individuals, and not just potential threats. Surely you can understand the importance of that. Stevens shifted, his jaw clenched. With all due respect, Chief, we're here to enforce the law. Our job is to keep the streets safe, not to play therapist or social worker. This focus on understanding is taking time away from real police work. Marcia felt a flicker of anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. And what do you consider real police work, Officer Stevens? Is it simply making arrests and writing reports? Or is it also about preventing crime by building trust and rapport with the community, by being a resource rather than a force of intimidation? Stevens's expression tightened, but he didn't back down. Look, I'm not saying that relationships don't matter, but some of us feel like we're being accused of things we haven't done. We're being told to examine our biases as if we're criminals ourselves. It feels insulting. Marcia nodded, understanding his perspective even if she disagreed with it. I understand that it might feel uncomfortable, Officer Stevens, but discomfort is part of growth. None of us are perfect. We all have biases that influence our actions, whether we realize it or not. These programs are meant to help us recognize those biases so we can serve the community better. This isn't about blame. It's about responsibility. Stevens seemed to falter for a moment, his expression softening slightly, but he quickly hardened again, his pride holding firm. Chief, I respect your position, but I think you're making a mistake. The more you push this agenda, the more you're dividing the department. We're here to follow orders, but morale is low. Some of us feel like we're being forced to question our integrity. Marcia leaned forward, her gaze intense. Then let me be very clear, Officer Stevens. If anyone's integrity is being questioned, it's because of their actions, not because of these trainings. The reality is that this department has a history, a reputation that we can't ignore. I took this position to make meaningful changes, and I'm not going to apologize for holding everyone to a higher standard. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with tension. Marcia could see the conflict in Stevens's eyes, the battle between his sense of duty and his discomfort with change. Finally, he sighed, looking away. Maybe you're right, Chief, he admitted, his tone grudging. Maybe there are things we need to confront, but it's not easy. Some of the guys, they feel like they're being singled out, like they're under a microscope. It's hard to stay motivated when you feel like your every move is being judged. Marcia softened slightly, sensing that Stevens was finally opening up, however reluctantly. I understand that change is difficult, especially when it feels personal. But I want you to know that I'm not here to single anyone out. I'm here to create a department that respects every individual, both inside and outside these walls. And that means sometimes confronting uncomfortable truths. Stevens nodded, though his expression was still guarded. I'll try to keep that in mind, Chief, but it's going to take time. Not everyone is going to be on board right away. Marcia smiled, a hint of warmth in her gaze. I don't expect miracles, Officer Stevens. Change takes time, and I'm willing to put in the work. But I need your help, and the help of every officer in this department. We can't create a better future unless we're all committed to it. Stevens met her gaze, and for the first time, Marcia saw a glimmer of respect in his eyes. It was tentative, a hesitant acceptance, but it was something. He nodded, rising from his seat. Thank you for your time, Chief. I appreciate the conversation. Marcia watched as he left, feeling a mix of hope and exhaustion. She knew that Stevens was far from a full ally, but the conversation had at least opened a door. And sometimes that was all it took to start moving forward. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as Marcia implemented her changes with a renewed determination. She met with officers one-on-one, attended community meetings, and held open forums where residents could voice their concerns directly to the department. The sessions were intense, often filled with raw emotion and painful stories of past interactions with police officers. Marcia listened to each story, her heart heavy with the weight of the community's distrust, but also filled with resolve. At one community forum, an elderly black woman named Mrs. Jackson shared a story that silenced the room. She recounted how, a few years back, her grandson had been stopped by police while walking home from his part-time job. He had been questioned, searched, and humiliated, all because he fit a description. The experience had left him scared, fearful of leaving the house alone at night. Marcia felt a pang of sadness as she listened, the woman's words a stark reminder of why she was fighting for these changes. When Mrs. Jackson finished, Marcia stood up, addressing her directly. "Mrs. Jackson, I want to thank you for sharing your story. I know it's not easy to relive those painful experiences, and I'm sorry for what your grandson went through. I want you to know that we're working to change things. It's not going to happen overnight, but I promise you that we're committed to making this department one that respects and protects every member of this community." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others looking skeptical. Marcia knew that trust wouldn't be rebuilt with words alone. It would take years of consistent action. But she was ready to make that commitment, to prove that this time, things would be different. As the meeting ended, Marcia found herself approached by a group of young activists, their faces a mix of curiosity and cautious hope. One of them, a young man named Andrew, extended his hand. "Chief Wilson, I just wanted to say, I didn't believe you at first. I thought this was all talk. But you're here, listening to us. That means something," he said, his voice laced with both gratitude and a touch of skepticism. Marcia shook his hand, meeting his gaze. "Thank you, Andrew. I know there's a long way to go, but I'm committed to making things better. And I need your help. Hold us accountable. Keep pushing us to do better. Change doesn't happen without people like you demanding it." Andrew smiled, nodding. "We will, Chief. You can count on that." As she left the forum that evening, Marcia felt a new sense of purpose, a quiet strength that came from knowing she was not alone in this fight. She had the support of some of her officers, the cautious respect of the community, and even the tentative trust of skeptics like Stevens and Andrew. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. Back at the precinct, Marcia sat alone in her office, looking out over the city lights. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, both within the department and with the public. But as she sat there, she felt a renewed sense of hope, a quiet belief that this time, maybe, things could really change. This was her precinct now, and she was determined to leave a legacy that would make her father proud, one of fairness, integrity, and justice for the ripple of change. As Chief Marcia Wilson sat in her office, gazing out at the city she had dedicated her life to, she felt a sense of both accomplishment and exhaustion. The past few weeks had been an intense battle of will, patience, and resilience. She had spent every day advocating for change, confronting biases within her own precinct, and listening to the community's grievances with an open heart. But tonight was different. Tonight was her first evening alone since beginning this journey, a rare moment to reflect on how far she had come and how much further she still had to go. Marcia's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from her father, as it had been on so many nights during this ordeal. A simple note, as he always sent, "Proud of you. Change is never easy. Keep going." She smiled, feeling a warmth that anchored her. Her father's unwavering belief in justice had shaped her values, guided her through every decision, and tonight reminded her why she had taken this path. She was ready to keep going, no matter how hard the journey. The next morning, as Marcia walked through the precinct, she sensed a shift. Officers nodded at her with a newfound respect, and some even stopped her to chat, expressing cautious optimism about the changes she had brought. Even Officer Stevens, once so openly resistant, seemed to have softened. As she passed his desk, he offered a small nod, just a subtle gesture, but one that carried the weight of an unspoken understanding. It was as close to a truce as she could expect, and she accepted it with quiet gratitude. Marcia's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her office door. Liz, her trusted assistant, entered, a serious look on her face. "Chief, the mayor has called a meeting." "It's urgent," Liz said, handing Marcia a folder. "They want an update on the precinct's progress, and, well, there are rumors that they're considering expanding your reforms citywide." Marcia raised an eyebrow. "Citywide reforms?" Liz nodded. "Your work has caught their attention. They're looking at you as a model for what the entire department could be." Marcia felt a surge of both excitement and trepidation. Expanding her reforms beyond her precinct would be a monumental task, and it would come with an even greater level of scrutiny and resistance. But it was also an incredible opportunity, a chance to shape the entire department, to create a legacy of integrity and fairness that could transform how the police interacted with the community. "Tell the mayor I'll be there," Marcia said, her voice steady with resolve. As Liz left, Marcia looked down at the folder in her hands. Inside were statistics and reports documenting the impact of her reforms over the past few months: reduced complaints from the public, fewer instances of force, and a noticeable increase in community cooperation. It was proof that her efforts were making a difference, however incremental. Later that day, Marcia arrived at City Hall, greeted by a room filled with senior officials, community leaders, and her fellow precinct chiefs. Mayor Randall, a charismatic man with a reputation for progressive policies, stood at the front, welcoming everyone with a smile. "Chief Wilson," he said, motioning her to the front, "thank you for being here. We've been hearing a lot about the work you're doing, and I think I speak for everyone here when I say that it's impressive." Marcia offered a polite smile, acknowledging the mayor's praise. "Thank you, Mayor Randall. It's been a challenging journey, but we're starting to see some positive changes." The mayor nodded, glancing around the room at the gathered officials. "That's exactly what we wanted to talk about today. The public has taken notice, and they're responding. People are feeling a new sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we can bridge the divide between law enforcement and the community. But we all know that this can't stop with one precinct." Marcia's heart raced as she listened, her mind already turning over the implications. She could sense where this was going, but she remained composed, waiting for the mayor to lay it out. "We're considering implementing similar reforms across all precincts," Mayor Randall continued, his tone serious. "But that kind of change requires strong leadership and experience. Chief Wilson, we would like you to head this initiative." There was a murmur of surprise and some visible discomfort from other precinct chiefs, but Marcia felt a surge of purpose. Leading a citywide reform would be the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to not only address the issues in her own precinct, but to reshape the entire department. "Mayor Randall, I'm honored," Marcia replied, keeping her tone steady. "But I want to be clear. Real reform isn't just about policies and training sessions. It's about changing the culture within our precincts, confronting biases, and building trust with the community. That means support from leadership at every level, and it means holding everyone accountable, including myself." The mayor nodded, a look of approval in his eyes. "And that's exactly why we believe you're the right person for this job." Marcia glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of her fellow chiefs, some of whom looked wary, others resigned. She knew that not everyone shared her vision, and that many of them would resist the changes she was determined to implement. But she also knew that they were beginning to see her as someone who was unafraid to tackle the hard issues, someone who could lead even when it was uncomfortable. "I accept, Mayor," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I'm ready to take on this responsibility. But I need a commitment from everyone in this room. This can't be my fight alone." One by one, the other chiefs nodded, though Marcia could tell that some were more reluctant than others. She understood their hesitation. Change was difficult, especially in an institution as steeped in tradition and hierarchy as the police force. But she was ready to lead them, to show them that there was a path forward, even if it was steep and difficult. In the weeks that followed, Marcia worked tirelessly, creating a blueprint for citywide reforms that included training, community outreach, and new accountability measures. She met with each precinct chief individually, addressing their concerns and helping them understand the importance of the changes. Some were more receptive than others, but Marcia remained patient, using her skills as both a leader and a listener to guide them toward her vision. She also began holding monthly community forums across different neighborhoods, inviting residents to share their experiences and voice their concerns directly. These sessions were often raw and emotional, filled with painful stories and honest criticism, but Marcia welcomed each one. She knew that listening, Truly listening was the first step to healing the rift between law enforcement and the public. One evening, after a particularly intense forum, Marcia was approached by a young woman named Carla, who had been vocal about her distrust of the police. Carla's brother had been wrongfully detained a year earlier, an experience that had left her with deep-seated anger and resentment. "Chief Wilson," Carla began, her voice tense but respectful, "I wanted to say, thank you. I still don't trust the police, but I can see that you're different. You're actually trying to change things, and I didn't think I'd ever see that." Marcia placed a gentle hand on Carla's shoulder, her expression warm. "Thank you, Carla. I know we still have a long way to go, and I can't erase the past. But I promise you, I'm doing everything I can to make this department one that you and everyone else in this community can trust." Carla nodded, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I'll hold you to that, Chief." Marcia watched as Carla walked away, her heart swelling with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that real change would take years, perhaps even decades, but moments like these, small as they were, reminded her that progress was possible, that every step forward was a victory, however small. As the months went by, Marcia's reforms began to take root. Complaints of misconduct dropped across the precincts, and community trust surveys showed a slow but steady improvement. Officers began to engage more with residents, attending neighborhood events, and even volunteering in local schools. The precinct walls, once rigid and insular, were starting to open up, allowing a sense of unity to flourish. One day, as Marcia was reviewing a report in her office, Captain Reed knocked on her door, entering with a broad smile on his face. "Chief, I thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing her a copy of the latest community engagement report. Marcia glanced at the numbers, her eyes widening as she read. Community satisfaction had increased by over 30%, and instances of community-led calls for police assistance had doubled. It was a clear sign that people were beginning to trust the department again, to see the police as partners rather than adversaries. "Captain Reed, this is incredible," Marcia said, her voice filled with disbelief and joy. Reed nodded, his own expression one of pride. "You did this, Chief. You set the example, and people followed." Marcia smiled, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, that there would be setbacks and moments of doubt. But today, she allowed herself to celebrate, to acknowledge the impact of her work. As she looked out over the precinct, watching her officers move with a newfound sense of purpose and unity, she knew that this was only the beginning. The journey toward justice and respect was long and difficult, but she was no longer alone. Together, they were building a legacy. One